Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our political discussion. And we want to discuss about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and United Nations Security Council when they had the 78th session. They had to talk about the war between Russia and Ukraine. And various leaders in that session had to give their view about Ukraine-Russia war. That is actually what we are going to discuss about today. But before we do that, I could request you kindly to take a minute or two and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Give this video thumbs up. Share the video to your friends. And if your friends are lovers of politics, then request them to subscribe to this YouTube channel. And also, whenever you subscribe to this YouTube channel, always make sure to smash the bell button. Now, let us go back to the discussion of the day about Russia-Ukraine war and what were the views that various president gave in the UN Security Council and how the war between Russia and Ukraine can be resolved. The Ukraine president, Zelensky, actually gave the speech about the war, and he told the world that Russia is actually committing crimes against humanity. And he said that Russia is actually violating the UN rules on the respect of country territory. And that's why Russia has annexed some of the territories belonging to Ukraine. And that is a violation of the UN Charter. And also, Russia is causing a lot of harm because it's using drones which are actually violating the humanity rules, because the drones are actually hitting any place. And also, Zelensky said that Russia is also weaponizing food. And that's why the price of food is skyrocketing in the world, because Ukraine is a major supply of grains to the entire world, and more so in Africa. And because Russia does not accept Ukraine to reach out to Africa to sell its food, because it does not allow Ukraine to pass through the Black Sea. And that's why the world is insufficient of food in the present days. And that is a violation of humanity. That is actually what Zelensky had to say. Also, United States of America came out and told the world that it is time for us to stand with Ukraine in all means. It is time that the Security Council must tell Russia by the face that it is violating the UN Charter about respecting boundaries of other nations. And United States went further and said that Russia is taking children from Ukraine to Russia, which is against the fundamental rules of humanity, because children are taken from their parents, which is against the rules of humanity. And also, major of the African states are actually saying that for us to solve Russia-Ukraine war, we must use diplomacy. We must not use the war to solve that, because wars will make the situation to deteriorate even further. So, most of the African nations are saying that peaceful talks is the only way forward to solve the crisis. But United States, France, and other European countries are saying that the world by now must stand with Russia in all ways, whether it is war, whether it is supplying weapons to Ukraine, and Russia must be warned because it has gone against humanity. So that's actually what were the views of many leaders in the world about Russia-Ukraine war. At the UN Security Council, Russia vetoed that agenda. And that means the UN cannot do anything. And that's why many states say that the use of the veto power must also be limited, its use, because it's making UN, which is the world body, sometimes not to do anything whenever it comes about violation of humanity. Please, I could like you to listen to some of the speeches which were made by world leaders about Russia. Please listen to these keenly before we come back. Listen to this, please.
Mr. President, the United Nations continues to work towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. I urge all countries to do their part to prevent further escalation and to lay the foundations for sustainable peace. We are fully committed to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This war is already causing limitless suffering. Its continuation risks further perilous escalation. There is never an alternative to dialogue, diplomacy, and a just peace. Thank you.
Since the start of the full-scale aggression launched by the state, which for some reason is still present here among the permanent members of the UN Security Council, there's already been 574 days of pain, losses, and struggle. Russia has killed at least tens of thousands of our people and turned millions into refugees by destroying their homes. Most of the world recognizes the truth about this war. It is a criminal and unprovoked aggression by Russia against our nation, aimed at seizing Ukraine's territory and resources. But it's not just that. The terrorist state is willing, through its aggression, to undermine all the grounds of international norms meant to protect the world from the wars. And I'm grateful to all those who have recognized Russian aggression as the violation of the UN Charter. Ukraine exercises its right to self-defense, helping Ukraine with weapons in this exercise by imposing sanctions and exerting comprehensive pressure on the aggressor, as well as voting for relevant resolution, would mean helping to defend the UN Charter. The resolutions of the General Assembly have clearly recognized the fact that the only source of this war is Russia. But this has changed nothing for Russia in the United Nations. However, these are the situations that have changed everything for the UN. We should recognize that the UN finds itself in a deadlock on the matters of aggression. Humankind no longer pins its hopes on the UN when it comes to the defense of the sovereign borders of nations. World leaders are seeking new platforms and alliances that could reduce the disastrous scope of problems, the problems that are met here within these walls with rhetoric rather than real solutions, with aspirations to compromise with killers rather than to protect lives. Life should be defended uncompromisingly to ensure successful protection. But I would not be here today if Ukraine had no proposals precisely regarding some specific solutions. Yesterday, in my address to the UN General Assembly, I said that Ukrainian peace formula had become the basis to update the existing security architecture in the world, to restore the real power of the UN Charter and the rule-based international order. Ladies and gentlemen, 574 days of the full-fledged Russian aggression means 574 reasons for changes in this chamber. And the numbers of votes in favor of this challenge actually amounts to billions. The absolute majority of people in the world want to live in the world free of aggression. In contrast to all us, there's only a few obsessed individuals in Moscow. Veto right should not serve those who are obsessed with hatred and war. What we observe in the United Nations is an increasing support for the idea that in cases of mass atrocities against human rights, veto power should be voluntarily suspended, but we can also observe that Russia will not give up this stolen privilege voluntarily. Therefore, the UN General Assembly should be given a real power to overcome the veto. This will be the first necessary step. If it is impossible to stop the war because all efforts are vetoed by the aggressor or those who condone the aggressor, it is necessary to bring this issue to the attention of the General Assembly. In the event of two-thirds of the votes reflecting the will of nations from Asia, Africa, Europe, both Americas, and the Pacific region, in other words, a global qualified majority, the veto should be effectively overcome, and such resolution of the General Assembly must be legally binding for all member states.
Briefing, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Prime Minister of the Republic of Albania. Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, Head of State and Governments, distinguished representatives, thank you all for being here today. The presence of such considerable number of dignitaries speaks to the very high importance of the issue at hand. Thank you, Secretary General, for your remarks. They resonate with and reflect the values and principles of our organization. President Zelensky, I'm grateful for your presence here at such a tragic moment in your country's history. Your strong words translate the pain of your compatriots and convey very clearly, together with your firm determination, the grit of your people and the unwavering hope of your nation. Excellencies, while today the world needs more than ever an acute sense of responsibility from all of us to confront the multiple challenges and threats facing our planet, conflicts, unconstitutional seizures of power, climate change, devastating floods and unforgiving droughts, including unpredictable and severe wildfires, what we witness instead is more and more disruptive attitudes, reckless acts, and growing conflictuality within and among states. In many parts of the world, the examples of force have proliferated, while the force of example has become a rarity. Who could have imagined, until not long ago, that in the third decade of the 21st century, a disastrous war started by a permanent member of this Council, would put Europe at risk by brutally undermining all the principles that gave birth to the United Nations. Who could have imagined, until only a few years ago, that an unjustified, unjust, and unprovoked military aggression of a big country against a new democracy would not be immediately, promptly, and universally condemned by all the nations who gather here and share the same goals and principles? How to understand the yes, but, or calls on both sides with arguments in order to avoid calling a spade, and which refuse to call a brutal aggression by its only and real name, a man-made tragedy that is inflicting untold suffering to the Ukrainian people, but also reverberating across world regions, hurting growth, raising prices, and threatening with hunger and starvation hundreds of millions of people. An aggression in the heart of Europe cannot be Europe's problem only, as some think, as some say, or as some whisper. Cynics may think that Ukraine is just a problem dropped on the lap of the democratic West to deal with, and they even mumble that what goes around comes around, implying that this is a natural payback for what might have happened before, elsewhere, in other times. Is it? Really? I invite everyone to think twice. This war of aggression must be everyone's business. Let me remind us by paraphrasing the tragic account by Martin Niemöller. First they came for Georgia. I did not speak out. Then they came for Crimea. It was not my country, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the whole Ukraine, but I was not Ukrainian, and I did not speak out. And then they came for me, but there was no one left to help and defend me. As we speak, there have been more than 26,000 civilians that have passed away. Tomorrow the number will be higher, and it will increase every other day for as long as this war continues. Given the inexcusable nuclear saber rattling that keeps coming time and again from different layers of the Kremlin, one is right to fear that one day, God forbid, this madness could turn into something far worse. And don't forget, as unimaginable today as this war was yesterday. Excellencies, we have a duty to help those in need, and in this respect, Ukraine and Ukrainians. We may differ, of course we may differ, on how to support Ukraine in its fight for freedom and dignity. We may have different views on how to end this war. Let's discuss them. But it would be an insult to the intelligence of this organization if we fail to unanimously recognize and say loudly who is the aggressor and who is the aggressed. It is the same sharp difference between war and peace as Tolstoy would remind you. Go back and read him. If we fail to admit this crystal clear truth, we are not only letting down Ukraine and its people, we are failing our core responsibility, compromising the future, and betraying all our children, from Brazil to Spain, from the Arctic to the Southern Pole. The struggle of Ukraine is also the struggle of everyone who aspires to live in a world where nations are free and equal, where territorial integrity is undisputable and their right to live in peace is unquestionable. The contrary is not only short-sighted, but utterly dangerous for everyone under this roof. This is why everyone has to do its part. Albania is a small country. Our continued support to Ukraine may not change the dynamics on the battleground, but it contributes to to not rewarding aggression, to not accepting annexation, and not letting the obvious become dubious. And again, I repeat, we may differ on how to deal with this. We may have different views on how to go towards peace. But how possibly we can have different views on who is the aggressor and who is the aggressed? Excellence, le devoir principal.
Excellencies, the main duty of the Security Council is to act decisively on behalf of the entire world and in the service of the world. We can well understand those who are many in number who ask, what is the Security Council doing? The abusive use of the right to veto, sadly, has held the Security Council hostage. It has paralyzed the Council, but it has not reduced it to silence. As we can see, the proof is here in this meeting. The force of rules and values bring us together. They should not be replaced by rules of force and the rejection of values. The world is dangerously tipping into what could become a tragedy for all of us.
Recalling the experience of the Western Balkans, we have seen where the path of brutality can lead to, and the tremendous costs it brings for all, including for the perpetrators. History has confirmed that those who saw war as a shortcut to achieve their goals ended up regretting it forever. Russia has tried many times to use, or better, misuse, the changed reality in the Western Balkans, particularly the birth of the Republic of Kosovo, to justify their neo-imperial dreams and the subsequent nightmare they have exported in Ukraine. No matter how hard one may try, Kosovo, whose independence has been sanctioned by the International Court of Justice, Chapter 14 of this Charter of United Nations, International Court of Justice, cannot serve as a pretext for territory grab or illegal annexations. If today a lasting peace in our region is within reach, this has to do first and foremost with the lesson learned that the most efficient way to overcome the past and shape a common future is through cooperation, not through division, by promoting free movement of people, goods, services, capitals, not by raising artificial barriers, by building bridges for our kids to enjoy freedom and prosperity, whatever their language, whatever their race, whatever their nationality, not erecting walls for our ghosts of the past to seek and hide in endless blame games. I'll end with this. The preamble of the United Nations Charter calls on us to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Important decisions are never a matter of chance. They are always a matter of choice. Albania has made its choice to stand for peace, development and progress, to stand with the aggressed, not with the aggressors, to stand with and to stand for Ukraine. Thank you. I resume now my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Guillermo Lasso Mendoza, Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador.
Su Excelencia.
Your Excellency Edi Rama, Prime Minister of the Republic of Albania and President of the Security Council.
Del Consejo de Seguridad.
I would like to thank you for your conduct of the Security Council during this month. It has been almost 19 months since the beginning of the war of aggression against Ukraine. the briefing provided by Secretary General Antonio Guterres
Federación de Rusia
continues to appeal to the Russian Federation to give peace an opportunity.
de continuar un día más.
This war cannot go on yet another day. The Russian Federation must immediately suspend its military operations in accordance with the order of the International Court of Justice, the ruling of that court, the highest legal system in the world, on the 16th of March 2022. This prolonged war was initially denied and was called a mere special military operation. In addition to destroying Ukraine, costing the lives of thousands of people, it is undermining the very purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, in particular that of territorial integrity. At the origin of this organization, when this organization was built, we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to preserve and spare future generations from the scourge of war, and to that end, to practice tolerance and to coexist in peace as good neighbors. On that basis, the United Nations Charter was built. It is unique. Ecuador has said this before, and we would insist on this point again today. There is not a charter for the South and another charter for the North, nor is there a charter for the West and one charter for the East. In all languages, the content of the charter is the same. It is one and indivisible. There is not one version in Russian and a different version in Spanish. In no case is the use of force to be used against the territorial integrity or the political independence of a state, or to be used in any way which runs counter to the purposes of the United Nations. How can we uphold the principles and purposes of the UN Charter for effective multilateralism and at the same time invade a neighboring country, or not condemn that invasion, maintaining indifference or complicity? On the contrary, to defend the territorial integrity of states means that we must respect and implement the provisions of the UN Charter. We must maintain international peace and security, not to aggress a third state, and to abstain from voting in disputes where we're a party. There are those who say that the crisis of peace and security is due to supposed shortcomings in the Charter, but no reform, no new international framework will be sufficient for peace and security if states are not determined to respect and implement these higher principles. What a fatal blow for multilateralism to have a military invasion of a neighboring country. This war, which has impacted the dynamics and the work done in this Security Council, continues to undermine trust in the UN system. However, beyond the difficulties which this body is facing to have a clear-cut response to this issue, we must underscore the enormous contribution of the United Nations for millions of peoples and humanitarian groups working on the ground, providing emergency assistance, in particular to women and children. I recognize the efforts of the Secretary General in the humanitarian sphere, including in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and we ask that that initiative be resumed. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, There are corrosive narratives which claim to justify this war, but there is no justification with any legal foundation. We have been told, for example, that the invasion of Ukraine is in response to a supposed group of countries of the West aiming to weaken Russia. We've been told that Russia is acting in self-defense in the face of anti-Russian policies with regard to some inhabitants or against Russian culture. But what greater act of xenophobia or disregard for one's neighbor than to carry out a war against one's neighbor? There's little truth in that position. We need only look at the pattern of voting in the General Assembly when resolutions have been adopted on the territorial integrity of Ukraine with a vast, clear majority. Of course, there is no veto which can halt the force of the General Assembly when it comes to defending the territorial integrity of its members. And this majority is not a majority of alliances or partnerships, as some claim. Ecuador rejects any invasion, regardless of the country committing that invasion. Moreover, and in particular, if that country holds a permanent seat in this body. The Secretary General, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, affirmed that only a power can impose order on chaos. It is the power of principles which transcend changing perceptions of coexistence in the short term. Ladies and gentlemen, among the hundreds of thousands of people who have fled war, there were many Ecuadorians. Many of them had to flee through emergency operations with a support team out of Ukraine and into neighboring countries. These people were some of the first people impacted by the serious humanitarian fallout of this invasion, which continues to worsen. Millions of people are now forced to leave their homes. They have been the hardest hit. Primarily women, girls, and boys are the ones who are hardest hit. This war has continued to have a global impact as well. It has exacerbated the nuclear threat. It has led to global food insecurity, and it has impacted economies, in particular the economies of developing countries. For all of these reasons, we appeal to the members of the Security Council, individually and collectively, to redouble our support so that the efforts and the good offices of the Secretary General can be played out on the humanitarian and political fronts, so that we can work towards just peace based on territorial integrity and on the principles of the UN Charter immediately.
President of the Republic of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for making me a part of this important meeting on how we can uphold better the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, with the unfortunate tragic events in Ukraine serving as a backdrop. I'm grateful to Secretary General Antonio Guterres for making a compelling case of the shared benefits we derive as member states when we choose to be peace-loving, as required by the Charter. Mr. President, none of us here in this chamber can claim not to be aware that our world is in a troubled place. The sharp differences in geopolitical competition among major powers and the intense convergence of the crises in the world, particularly of conflicts, climate change, inequality, unconstitutional changes of government, and unsustainable development, have undermined global trust and solidarity and unraveled the common logic that has prevailed since 1945, which is, it is better to suffer the inadequacies of the multilateral system for the greater good than to pursue the chaos of the unknown for national advantage. In this context, and being mindful of the reality that neither geographic boundaries nor political ideologies have been able to isolate any state from the burden of the prevailing crises, Ghana continues to hope in earnest for an end to the war against Ukraine and for the construction of a future marked by peaceful coexistence, mutual cooperation, and brotherly relations between the two neighboring countries. Indeed, the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine is plainly wrong, and we have said so on many platforms. The war has had an increasingly devastating toll on the people of Ukraine and the rest of the world, particularly for those of us in Africa, and has challenged our shared values of international peace and security. The turnings of the war have constrained collective efforts in reinvigorating multilateralism and impeded common approaches to confront effectively several complex challenges of our time. For those of us in Ghana, however, the unfolding situation is not a lost cause. Whilst we are rightfully distressed by what is happening around us, we believe that together we can still mitigate the challenges of the unknown if we are prepared to cooperate for a peaceful, careful, managed process of the reform of global institutions that would redistribute fairly responsibilities and authority to reflect the present realities of our world. We also believe that history has a lesson to teach, and the painful lessons of the two previous world wars inspired the solemn commitments made by the founders of the United Nations to refrain from the use of force in their relations among states. That common understanding to replace force and might with the rule of law, cooperation, and the peaceful settlement of disputes underpins the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and remains valid if we are to avoid a Hobbesian state of affairs in interstate relations. We must thus work together strongly to reverse the growing fragmentation of our world and the elevation of nationalist ideologies and actions above commonly accepted rules. Violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states and attempts to normalize such violations or selectively apply the rules of international law and the Charter would only undermine the promise of the past and the hope for future generations. It is in this regard that Ghana continues to be a firm advocate for dialogue and diplomacy in resolving the Russian war against Ukraine. We do not do so because of want of a resolution of the dispute at any cost, but united in our belief with many others, we believe the only pathway for a comprehensive, peaceful, and sustainable resolution of the dispute is one that must be just and based on the Charter of the United Nations and international law. In taking a principled position on the conflict in Ukraine, Ghana has been concerned about the ramifications of the war on the global community and multilateralism. We therefore welcome the opportunity that the new agenda for peace provides, which is to reset our common understanding on how, among others, we relate with each other as states, can reinforce the preemptory norms of international law that have provided us stability for almost 8 decades, and find new ways of addressing old challenges that continue to undermine states and the sovereignty of nations. Mr. President, in support of the choices we need to make for a renewed and inclusive in multilateralism, I would want to share three key messages. Firstly, many of the organs and institutions established by the Charter, such as for the Security Council, continue to be relevant, but the Council's composition and working methods need renewal through the completion of the long outstanding reforms. In support of the Common African Position on Security Council reforms contained in the Azulwini Consensus, Ghana urges a transformation of the dialogue among member states to envisage an endpoint that delivers a Security Council that is representative and which also addresses the historical injustice done the continent of Africa. To overcome knotty discussions around the veto, we encourage the ongoing efforts to limit its use and the subsequent placement of a moratorium on its use that will lead progressively to its removal over a reasonable period of time. We cannot continue to have a Security Council that is structurally limited from being effective and yet demands universal acceptance for its decisions. As with many other things in life, with changes, we need to adapt, and with authority comes a responsibility that must be kept. Secondly, the peace of the world is indivisible and integrated with all other global arrangements beyond our collective security. Our efforts of preventive diplomacy must be comprehensive and broad-based. We need to be aware that, for instance, inimical economic and financial policies have an enduring impact on peace, and that global policies in the structure and functioning of international institutions cannot remove the centrality of peace from their raison d'etre. We must strengthen in a comprehensive and integrated manner our efforts in preventing the outbreak of violence or resurgence of new conflicts. Thirdly and finally, multilateralism at the global level must be accompanied by effective regional partnerships, partnerships that help to anticipate better threats to our common humanity, which prioritize specific means for resolving differences, and which cuts across regions to enhance its effectiveness when required. When we fail to leverage fully the potential of regional bodies, we can only have ourselves to blame when multilateral efforts at the global level are unable to deliver. In ending, I call again for peace in Ukraine and emphasize, as my delegation has often done in this Council, that there is no alternative to winning the peace in Ukraine. We hope the Council can help this United Nations to assume an enhanced role in support of peace efforts around the world, but in particular in Ukraine, for the benefit of all peoples. Mr. President, I thank you for your indulgence.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Akufo-Addo for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Alain Berset, President of the Swiss Federation.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, first and foremost, for organizing this debate, and I also wish to take this opportunity to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for his remarks. But beyond his remarks, I wish to thank him for his steadfast, unstinting commitment to the advancement of peace, the advancement of dialogue, and especially when it is most difficult. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, the facts, and they are not positive. The times we live in are marked by the questioning of multilateralism, the multiplication of conflicts, and the deepening of inequalities. And there's a question, where's our responsibility? Where does our responsibility, our shared responsibility lie, our responsibility, we who have convened here, at the very minimum, that is to recall the essential principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. I've had a copy here, of course, and to fulfill the mandate which has been entrusted to us. This core text expresses our desire, our shared desire, the shared desire of all peoples to live in peace. And this text is a guarantor of universal values, the overarching principles of a multilateral order, sovereign equality of states, and a prohibition on the use of force, defense of human rights, including economic, social progress for people. And in this war, as we know, during war, the suffering of civilians is a common denominator. It is always civilian suffering. And international humanitarian law imposes obligations upon us and upon all parties to conflict. As you are aware, Swiss is a depository of the Geneva Conventions. We are faithful to the long-standing tradition in this regard, and we are very much staunchly determined to uphold it and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. And as members of the Council, we have committed to commit and implement this clear, unique mandate conferred upon us by the Charter of the United Nations, conferred upon all of us here, namely the maintenance of international peace and security. With Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, the Charter has been violated at a large scale. On a massive scale, yet session after session, Russia, a permanent member of this Council, has been denying its responsibility. Its responsibility for the thousands of dead and wounded in Ukraine, its responsibility for the millions of displaced persons, and finally its responsibility for all those plunged into deep insecurity wherever they are in the world, including, incidentally, in Russia. The consequences of this war, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the consequences of this war are planetary in nature. Global food security has been undermined. The energy sector has been disrupted. Nuclear risks are increasing. Inequalities are growing. Switzerland demands that the Russian Federation respect the Charter, that it respect its principles. And once again, we call upon the Russian Federation to cease hostilities, to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory, and respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, while the mandate of the Security Council is clear, it is not always as effective as it should be, as one would desire. While the objective is to save lives, guarantee global security, reinforce stability, our discussions are bogged down on issues that fail to produce tangible results on certain issues. This Council must not squander the most precious asset at its disposal, the trust of those who rely on it, to work to guarantee them a life in dignity and peace. And we have the means to fulfill this mandate, as has been illustrated in the 26 resolutions that the Security Council has adopted since the month of January. These are resolutions that are geared towards promoting peace and security in Colombia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in South Sudan. And these examples are really there to show us that the Security Council, even though it is more difficult than in the past, has retained its capacity for action. Of course, there's an urgent need for reform, and Switzerland has been committed for a number of years to greater and better representation, beginning with the African countries, committed also to better working methods. And yet we are all aware of the fact that no reform can replace the will of states to respect the Charter. In the new agenda for peace, the Secretary General has indicated further steps forward to step up our action in multilateralism, to strengthen to close ranks around the principles of universality, of solidarity, and trust. And we have been assuming this duty of solidarity. In Ukraine, we are committed to alleviating the suffering of the civilian population, rendering justice to the victims, promoting a political solution to the conflict in due time. We have opened our doors to people fleeing the war. We have been delivering humanitarian aid. We have been collaborating with the Ukrainian government on the process of reconstruction. And the challenges, the tasks facing Ukraine are immense. To give just one example, an area four times the size of Switzerland. Switzerland is not a large country. 4 times the size of Switzerland. That is the territory of Ukraine, which has been contaminated with mines. And there, too, we have been supporting humanitarian demining with our know-how and with deliveries of equipment and a commitment that we will continue to shore up. And it is in the same spirit of solidarity that we are calling for the relaunching of the Black Sea Initiative. We wish to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to the Secretary General for his tireless efforts in this regard. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, multilateralism is the only option. The only option to achieve peace, the only way to move away from individualistic thinking in which each side seeks only to defend their own interests, to maximize their own influence, the only option to relaunch the search for common sustainable solutions that guarantee a dignified life for all. And against this backdrop, in this spirit, Switzerland welcomes diplomatic initiatives in favor of a lasting peace in Ukraine, a peace rooted in the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, the Charter which is truly the cornerstone of peaceful coexistence of all states. In the past and today, threats, isolationism, violence have never provided answers to the dysfunctions and imbalances of the world in which we live. And this Council, Security Council, can only successfully fulfill its mandate. Therefore, ensure the common desire of all people of this world to live in peace and security to be made a reality. Only can it achieve this if it acts in a spirit of trust and collaboration. This spirit must guide everyone around this table. Today we have an opportunity to reverse course, to change the situation. We have this opportunity, but there's a need for will to be there, for ardent will to be there, because a lasting peace is worth more than any fleeting gain. Thank you.
After listening to that, we can say that we need to stand with Ukraine in the war. But the way we have to do it, it's quite different, because different leaders had to give different views. So my listener, what is your views about Ukraine-Russia war? Please drop your comment in the comment section below. And if this is your first time to come into this YouTube channel, I could request you kindly to take a minute or two and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Give this video a like, share the video to your friends, and if your friends are lovers of politics, then request them to subscribe to this YouTube channel. And for those ones who have subscribed to this YouTube channel, I say thank you. May God bless you abundantly, because you always inspire us to come up with this kind of political analysis. And with that, I say thank you until we meet in our next political conversation. Thank you so much.